So now I'm going to invite Chad to join me and to talk about some other things that we observed in the data this year. So, there was another, a big sort of global news story, I guess, the wave of protest that originated in the United States, but also went worldwide against excessive police violence and the frequent killings of Black Americans by police officers in the United States and by state agents in other countries also, sparked originally by the murder of George Floyd by police officers. So Chad, do our data speak to this issue?
Thanks, Talia. Yeah, they do indeed. So, as you noted, following the murder of George Floyd last year, we observed protests in not only the United States, but also in Australia, Brazil, Fiji, Hong Kong, Liberia, Mexico, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, New Zealand, Taiwan, and just several other countries around the world. And this speaks to the global nature of white supremacy and the degree to which issues faced by Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, and others here in the United States, those experiences resonate with oppressed people worldwide. And I think this is reinforced by the data that's on our rights tracker. So I'm going to share my screen now and just take us there and walk us through it. So if you go to our rights tracker, at rightstracker.org. You can, go immediately to look at, say, people at risk, and you can see all these different pre-populated, pre-selected identifiers that we have there. And so, for instance, if you looked at people of particular races, you can see that experts in every single country that I mentioned by name just a few minutes ago, they all had at least one right where experts said people of particular races were at risk. Now, across these groups and these countries, as well as for the other 38 pre-identified group names, pre-selected identifiers, if you will, for which we collect data, there are just many, many, many stories that could be told from the data. But given, the inciting incident that led to the protests last year and its aftermath, and to some extent just because of where I'm located, I'm going to take a deep dive at George Floyd's in my home country, the United States, and the way it treats racial minorities, especially Black people. So we'll start by going to countries here, and we can immediately find the United States. And, Black people in the United States have long faced systemic discrimination and, repeatedly experienced attempts by various states within the United States at suppressing their right to vote. And all of these issues, come up repeatedly in the data that can be observed on HRMI's rights tracker. And so first, if we take a look at the United States scores across the 13 rights for which we produce metrics, you can look at this at a glance page, the first page that comes up when you go to the United States. And what you see is that for, these rights that we have data on, there are only two where the United States scores exceed what we might call sort of a bad rating. The vast majority of these rights, right, the United States scores either very bad or bad, right, according to the way we measure these things. So right off the bat, it would appear that the United States is vastly underperforming what people might expect it to do, just from looking at, at a glance at its performance across all of these rights. But you might ask yourself, okay, so HRMI says this is bad, or HRMI says this is very bad, right? What does that actually mean? What does that mean in comparative perspective? Well, you can take a closer look at that by going to the different rights pages that we have on the rights tracker. So for instance, if we think about the United States performance on economic and social rights. So for instance, the United States performance on the right to health. And because the United States is a high-income country, it's a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is largely populated by high-income democracies. I'm going to limit the countries we look at to OECD states, members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and high-income countries. And so you can do that with the filters there. And looking at the 31 countries that are both high income states that are members of the OECD, what we observe is on the right to health, the United States actually ranks last, and by a reasonable margin compared to the country immediately above it. Now, I can tell you that this isn't just like an outlying score for the United States on economic and social rights. If you look at the other metrics for which we have economic and social rights data for the United States basically always comes into the bottom quarter of countries that are OECD high income states on economic and social rights. Now, another place to look for these kinds of comparisons would be in what we would call empowerment rights. And so I should note that for empowerment rights, they're based in that expert survey that Talia was talking about earlier. We currently collect those data for 39 countries around the world, and 5 of those countries are high-income OECD states. And so if you look at the way the United States performs on these rights, which include the rights to expression and opinion, the right to participate in government, and the right to assembly and association, you see that the United States score comes in last among this group of countries. Now, to be fair, we can't say that with absolute certainty that the United States is doing worse than, say, South Korea. We report our scores on civil and political rights with uncertainty, and if these bands overlap a good bit, it says that we're not completely certain that these are different scores. Now, to be fair, you can do some math, which I've done, and sort of see the probability that the United States is doing worse. And there's about a 76% chance that it's performing worse than South Korea here. So, take that for what you will. We tend to be pretty careful at those levels of probability about saying that they're different. But nevertheless, the United States is underperforming here. Now, while I said we can't be certain about the difference between the United States and South Korea here, we certainly can if we turn to looking at, say, the right to participate in government, where the United States score falls far short of all other high-income OECD countries. And indeed, there's more than a 99% chance that the United States is performing worse than South Korea on this right. Things look even worse overall if we switch to what we call safety from the state rights. So these are the rights to what we might call physical integrity rights: freedom from forced disappearance, or from extrajudicial execution, freedom from the death penalty, from torture and ill treatment, or from political and arbitrary imprisonment. And as you can see here, the United States falls well below all of the other high-income OECD states on its performance for safety from the state. And indeed, that holds up across every single individual one of the rights that make this up. So if I look, for example, at the right to be free from extrajudicial execution, the United States comes in a distant last on that score. That's true for all 5 of the safety from the state rights that we collect data on. So, given this, you might ask yourself, why does the United States perform so poorly across the board on the human rights we measure? And there are a number of reasons, including other types of ethnic and racial discrimination, for instance, against Latinx people and against indigenous people. But one reason is almost certainly systemic discrimination against Black people. And so one way to look at this is to return to the United States page and go look at the people at risk tab on that page. And as you can see on this page, I can select people of particular races, and that will highlight that group in each of the word clouds below. And as you can see, and tell me exactly the percentage of our respondents that identify that group as being at risk for violations of that right. So as you can see here, as I scroll through, people of particular races actually appear in every single one of these word clouds. Respondents from the United States identify people of particular races as being at risk for abuses of each of the rights for which we collect data. And for 11 of the 13 rights listed, more than 50% of our respondents selected that group as being particularly at risk. So this also comes out in the summaries of what respondents told us when we asked for greater context. So if I move down here to safety from the state, for instance, and we think about, those being the core rights that sort of sparked the protests last year, right? For instance, chief among them, the right to freedom from extrajudicial execution. First, you can see that it is the most chosen group on that right. So people of particular races were the group that were most chosen by our respondents as being at risk for extrajudicial execution in the United States last year. 76% of our respondents, as shown here, selected that group. That's actually true on 4 of the 5 physical integrity rights. It's true for the right to be free from the death penalty. It's true for the right to be free from torture and ill treatment, and it's right for the right to be free from arbitrary or political arrest and imprisonment. So in all of those cases, the most chosen group was people of particular races. And if you look, at who was particularly identified, when we asked for more context here, our respondents told us that indeed African Americans and Black people were the people of a particular race that they were talking about here, alongside Latinx people and Native Americans, as I mentioned earlier. So, that's overall disheartening. It suggests that systemic discrimination is widespread, but it's probably not a big surprise to a lot of the people on this call. These findings aren't new. We've seen similar things every year. We've collected data for the United States, and the problems long precede the existence of our metrics. But it's important to note that this systemic discrimination also extends to the very means by which people might change these discriminatory policies. So if we look at our empowerment rights, for instance, the right to participate in government, once again, the group that our respondents identified as being most at risk for violations of their right to political participation are people of particular races. And if we look once again at more context there, Black and African Americans, Latinx people, and everyone who is not white are identified as people whose right to vote is being particularly, restricted. And, this effectively makes it more difficult for those experiencing the very discrimination we're talking about to do anything about it through institutionalized free and fair elections. And so, it shouldn't be surprising that the United States and much of the world, in solidarity with people in the United States, burst out into non-institutionalized means of trying to change those policies last year via the wave of protests that we observed in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. But if we look at empowerment rights, what you'll observe is that this wave of protests in the United States was actually accompanied by a significant decrease in respect for the right to assembly and association. As you can see, as this drop in the US score from 6.6 in 2019 to 5.3 in 2020. And so, you might ask yourself, why did we observe this decrease? Well, it would appear it happened in large part because the state explicitly cracked down on the very protesters that were protesting against this violence. So our respondents say, for instance, here that protesters and demonstrators, particularly those protesting police violence following the murder of George Floyd, and those who were protesting for left-wing causes, were highly vulnerable to restrictions on their right to assembly and association. Once again, people of particular races, including Black and African Americans, and everyone who isn't white. And our respondents note here that some of the methods used to break up these protests were quite violent, right? They included chemical irritants, torture, force, arbitrary arrest and detention, and kinetic projectiles. And so, we even observe these same sorts of results over in our safety from the state data. When we look at who was at risk for arbitrary arrest, well, protesters or demonstrators, particularly those affiliated with Black Lives Matter, or who was at risk for torture or ill treatment. Once again, protesters or demonstrators, particularly those affiliated with Black Lives Matter. So in sum, what does the rights tracker tell us about Black people's human rights in the United States? Well, overall, our, our our data show a clear picture of systemic discrimination across all the kinds of human rights that we measure. And further, the opportunity to challenge those discriminatory policies are further limited by discriminatory policies surrounding voting. And right now, we're seeing an increasing number of those passed within the United States. And then finally, when the only option left for attempting to change these discriminatory policies is to take to the streets and engage in protest, the government is responding to these protests with more limitations on assembly and association and with additional state violence to try to reduce the incentive to change state policy. So, this reinforces the interconnectedness of all of these rights and, demonstrates that when one right is violated, when there's discrimination along one dimension of these rights, it weakens the protections, proffered across all the other rights. Worryingly, we're only 1 year removed from the height of these protests, and beyond sort of small symbolic gestures, little has changed for the better in terms of policy. And so unless something remarkable happens in the next 6 months, I sadly anticipate that all of these issues are going to remain in next year's Rights Tracker update for the United States. In any case, this is just one story, right, that can be told using our Rights Tracker data. And there are many, many others for other groups and other countries. And so my hope with what we do, right, is that people around the world use these data to push for change, including right here in the United States where I'm located right now.
Oh, thanks, Chad. It's all a pretty sobering story. There's one thing that's been on my mind this week, particularly as I've been talking to a lot of journalists about our new data. I often find that people, especially from the United States and from Australia and New Zealand, these are the conversations I've had, that when they see these bad scores, they're quite surprised. What would you tell people who are surprised by how low the scores are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it speaks, as I mentioned before with the global protests around George Floyd's death, to a larger global issue. And, to be frank, countries like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, these are all countries that are descended from settler colonies, right? And, they remain dominated by white people. And overall, I think the stories that get told about those countries, the stories that find their ways into the media, the way people talk about these countries, the public perception of those countries and what life is like in those countries largely come from the perspective of the privileged white people that live in those countries. It's a lot rarer that we actually see what life is like in those places for Black people, for Indigenous people, for immigrants, for refugees, for ethnic and racial minorities, for, just the other people that live in these countries. And it speaks to the degree to which white supremacy is really embedded in the way the world is presented to us. And as a result, a lot of the time our gut impressions about how various states are likely to perform on human rights are informed by that very white supremacy, even for those of us that have tried to do the work of moving past that and looking past that. So I would argue this is one of the reasons we need things like HRMI's data, right? Data like these, when they're taken from the best information available, they can serve as a check on our biases. They can force us to confront the limitations of our current policies. And hopefully, our as a group, as our long run ambition, right, is to generate a race to the top in terms of how countries treat people. And so, that's how I hope people will use our data. And I hope we see it. We've seen some early evidence of that, and I hope we continue to see it.
Yeah, may it happen soon. Thank you, Chad.